The 1970s were, that was big change time in the business. The Beatles had just hit, 10 years before there was a shortage of guitars, and then there was a, big flourishing in new ideas, right?
Yeah. It was almost a glut of guitars at that point in time. Because the 70s is when everybody had gotten cranked up throughout the end of the 60s, and everybody's guitars are everywhere.
I got to say, the big guys at the time, they were corporate. It was Norlin for Gibson, and it was CBS for Fender, and they were slow to move. They were kind of dinosaurs. Their quality wasn't super good at the time, and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of opportunity for a new company to come along, or a lot of new companies, frankly, to come in and start filling the void.
I started out collecting guitars in '68. I was getting some pretty cool stuff, and I wanted to show them to English rock and roll bands, and try to sell them. Go backstage at the different shows. So the word got around, and people started calling me. And I was in my parents' house, and I had a playroom full of instruments. And then I'd go downtown and bring them to the shows and sell them guitars backstage. That led to opening up a used music store.
In August of 1972, Paul Hamer, along with business partner Craig Hendy, would open up Northern Prairie Music at 277 Green Bay Road in Wilmette, Illinois, which is located about 14 miles north of downtown Chicago. Both Paul and Craig had a similar appreciation of American guitars from the 1950s and 60s and decided to pool their resources and open up a shop together.
Northern Prairie
Music was Paul Hamer.
Yeah.
Jol Dantzig.
But it was just a music store originally, and they had a thing like you did. They liked older guitars that most people didn't care about.
Yeah, and they had all the parts too. The ABR ones and the nickel this and that and the right stuff. And if you had a Les Paul, if something's wrong and you want to get it fixed, they did that stuff.
The birth of this vintage guitar market was due in large part by the changes happening at both Fender and Gibson during the late 60s and early 70s.
The quality went to hell. Part of that was when Fender sold out to CBS, the quality suffered. When Ted McCarty left Gibson and the administration replaced him with Stan Rendell, who just wanted to cut corners and ramp up production but save money, he cheapened the product.
I was one of those kids that would call them up and go, "Hey, I got this great idea. Why don't you make the Les Pauls with like curly maple tops? Because like you guys have plain maple now, but in the old days, these old guitars that I have in my store, they have curly maple on them." And they'd go, "No, we don't do that." And I'd say stuff like, "Well, the pickups on these old guitars, they really sound great. Can you make the new ones just like that?" And they go, "No, that's not what we do."
The big guys were not producing guitars in those days that were as appropriate as we thought they should be. And some people took action on this, notably Bernard Rico with B.C. Rich and Grover Jackson with Jackson Charvel, Dean Solinsky with Dean Guitars. And the first really was Paul Hamer and Jol Dantzig with Hamer guitars.
It was kind of a point in time where one generation had lost touch of what the new music was and a new generation was coming up. And we were part of that new generation who played Les Pauls and Strats through two Marshall stacks and played rock. So we had that kind of edge and we advertised it that way. So I worked as a technician for a place called Music Dealer Service in Chicago. Music Dealer Service was the company that had the warranty service franchise from all these different manufacturers. So if somebody brought in an amplifier that wasn't working or a keyboard or something, you'd take it in, write a ticket for it, and then Music Dealer Service would bring their truck to your store once a week and pick up whatever you had for repair, take it, drop off what they were repairing for you last week.
And then I started hanging out at Northern Prairie, which was owned by a guy named Craig Hendy. was kind of like a real wheeler dealer sort of vintage guy. He started out in his basement, buying stuff from classified ads. His partner was a guy named Paul Hamer, who I had played with a few years earlier in a band. And they had this little shop. It was just a little hole-in-the-wall, 800-square-foot storefront. And they were essentially doing what I was doing, and that was scouring the want ads, going into pawn shops, finding, what we called vintage guitars, but they weren't really known as vintage guitars to the general public yet. Mm-hmm. And, picking them up cheap, fixing them up, cleaning them. They had kind of outgrown doing it out of their basement and had started this storefront. And I just started hanging out there, helping them out, and putting in more and more hours. And then at a certain point, Hendy kind of lost interest in the store, and he sold out, and I became Hamer's partner.
Well, Paul and I were partners, and he tended to be more the sales sort of guy. He liked to shake hands, and he was a very outgoing and affable kind of guy. People liked him. He had an easy laugh, and he really liked the sales end of the thing. I was more the guy who liked to work on the gear. I was interested in the cool stuff, the mechanics of how it was done, how it was built, and I'm more of a backroom kind of guy, hands-on sort of person.
Since the vintage electric market was relatively new, they were able to buy what are now considered iconic guitars at relatively inexpensive prices.
As a frame of reference, I recently found a bill from 1974 from a notable guitar dealer friend of mine in St. Louis for 4 instruments, a single cut junior, a double cut junior, a reverse Firebird 1, and a 63 Esquire, and the total for the 4 of them was $825.
I'm thinking the most expensive Gibson guitar, at least a solid body guitar, is a Les Paul Custom, which was $650 at the time. We had just sold, some big rock star a 58 Les Paul Standard for $2,600. I mean, we're talking about a 15-year-old guitar where we sold for multiples of what they can get for their most expensive Les Paul. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with this picture? These guys obviously don't understand what's going on. They don't know the market.
They weren't really called vintage instruments at the time. They were just used guitars to most people. But we started to notice a difference between the older guitars and the newer guitars. The older guitars seemed to be made better and had a certain sound and feel that the newer guitars lacked. And we noticed also that the professional touring musicians and recording musicians were starting to pick up on that as well. So we started seeking out the older guitars and selling them to professionals. And that's how we got in touch with a lot of the big names of the day.
As the market for vintage guitars began to increase, so did the number of repairs that were needed at the shop, both from guitars purchased for resale or as customers came in with their own guitars. In those days, the aftermarket for parts was practically non-existent, so everything had to be ordered directly from the major manufacturers such as Gibson and Fender. At some point, Gibson would notice the significant number of parts being ordered by Northern Prairie Music and would eventually make them an authorized warranty and repair center.
And they were having a problem that year where somebody had installed all the bridges on Les Pauls 1/8 of an inch off. So they had kids all over the country that couldn't tune the instruments. So they asked me to help with that problem so that kids in Chicago area could bring their guitars into a store, get it fixed, and take it home.
We had gone up to the Kalamazoo factory a number of times, to tour it and to get some background and see what was available, learn some techniques, and just become better repair people.
Despite the growing number of repairs coming into the shop, it would be the vintage guitar business that would constitute a majority of their sales. Many of their customers were touring musicians, and Paul and Joel would often make calls on these bands traveling through the area, even finding clever ways of getting backstage or up to their hotel room without authorization.
You know, it was pretty remarkable because the security wasn't what it is today. We just learned the art of looking like you belong where you are. And we would, we had the code cracked for okay, they're playing this venue, so they're probably staying at one of these two hotels. And then you just call there and you go, yes, I'd like to speak to Mr. Simmons, please. They would connect you to Kim Simmons' room. We'd say, hi, we've got some vintage guitars down in the lobby. Interested? And that was usually all it took.
The idea of building guitars came somewhat accidentally. In March of 1973, Jol Dantzig decided to build a Flying V bass.
Once I saw how the guitars were constructed and what we could do in terms of repair, it just seemed a hop, skip, and a jump to actually making a guitar from scratch. So I wanted a custom bass to use with my band, and I wanted something that was different.
There was a guy at another music store in town who was a violin, cello, bass repairman, and he knew how to work with wood. And so I talked to him and I said, why don't we do this together, and you can work in the evening at your place, and I'll bring stuff over to you, and then you do the wood repairs. I'll do the setups and the electronics, and we started out that way.
And we'd hooked up with a repair guy who was named John Montgomery, who was, in addition to doing band instruments and repadding saxophones and that sort of thing, he was very good with woodworking and stains and that sort of thing.
And he was a pivotal figure for us because he became one of the first partners in what when we started Hamer Guitars, which basically grew out of the Northern Prairie shop.
And he was a super nice guy. He was a lot older than I was, but for some reason he liked me. I went to him one day and I said, we're doing all this repair work, we're doing refinishing stuff. Why don't we build a guitar? He goes, I've never built a guitar before. I said, I've never built a guitar before. I know what it's supposed to do,
It took a long time to make that first instrument, but, we made it down in John's basement. At that point, really hadn't thought about making guitars as, our vocation. We weren't looking to become a brand. I just wanted something cool that other people didn't have, and it was a sight gag. It was the first, it made it look like a Les Paul Custom. It was black with the multi-stripe binding. I screwed a SG, that nylon-handled whammy bar, and that's how it started. To be honest, in the very beginning, it was something that we would take to the shows along with the vintage guitars, and thinking, well, this will give our enterprise a little bit more cachet with the touring musicians. Hey, look, see, here's something really cool that you might like to look at, not even thinking that they would buy them.
I was playing an EBO, a Gibson EB3, and Rickenbacker basses, and I wanted something that was a little different, wanted something that was a little more showy and had more of the vintage aesthetic. So what we did is we kind of morphed a couple of different guitar styles, as if a Les Paul Custom, had the multi-stripe binding and the black look. If a Les Paul and a bass had gotten together and their offspring was a Flying V, this would be it. And just kind of crazy stuff like putting the whammy bar on it. And surprisingly, for the first instrument that we ever made, we used a lot of Gibson parts on this, but the bridge and the fingerboard. But it was really a great sounding bass. I think if it hadn't turned out so well, things might have been totally different. I think for a first try for a 20-year-old kid, and John Montgomery has to be thanked for basically he built this bass with me getting in the way, and I think I redid the binding on the body twice because I didn't do it right, and he'd come over and he'd go, damn it, you should have done this. And John, why didn't you tell me? Let me do that. Get out of the way.
Also in 1973, Paul Hamer would meet Jan Ackerman of the group Focus.
This is one of the first guitars that was redone by Hamer. This is Jan Ackerman. This guitar used to be a Les Paul Professional.
We took the guitar and put a maple top on it, and sunburst, rerouted for different pickups. And it was just kind of an experiment, something for him that he wanted. Okay, that's the V for Jan Ackerman, one of the very first thing, and you can see just barely the GI, it's with the Gibson logo on it.
The body and neck of this new Flying V guitar had come from Jim Beach, a fellow builder and collector who also owned a vintage guitar and repair shop called Wooden Music in Chicago.
He was kind of on the forefront of all this stuff, and he had made some Flying Vs and some Explorers in his shop. He was a machinist. He had a Bridgeport mill, and he was doing woodwork on a Bridgeport. He had a bunch of Explorer guitars that he was building because you couldn't get an Explorer.
It's important to note that the Explorer and the Flying V designs were both released in 1958 by Gibson as a way of offering a modern guitar to compete with the recent Fender Stratocaster. This initial 1958 to 59 run of Flying Vs were considered a failure as Gibson would produce less than 100 models during this time. The Explorer would sell less than half that. While the Flying V was later modified and reissued in the late 60s, it would be 1976 before Gibson would reissue the Explorer.
Flying Vs and Explorer Gibsons made in 58 and 59, well, I wasn't actively buying guitars, but those things sold so poorly. I can still remember new ones in the store because in 63 and 4, Jack Moore's Guitar Studio in Chicago still had them. I remember brand new Flying V. It was $250 list price, and that's what he still wanted for it. And people laughed at it. Such an ugly guitar. Who's going to ever want that thing?
Anybody at Gibson, they didn't want to have anything to do with the Explorer in the early 70s because it had been a complete flop, and they had moved on. They were making the Ripper, the Marauder, whatever. They. All those great guitars.
In 1970, Paul Hamer had a rare opportunity to study an original Gibson Explorer.
And we went to this festival in Iowa, and since I had been at Woodstock, I had remembered that the stage at Woodstock, they had a little platform slightly below the stage where people were sitting. So we got there early and we went right into the pit. We just sat there, and everybody just assumed we were there for something, So we spent the whole festival right in the press pit, and we got to walk backstage and meet everybody. So Leon Russell had a guitar player in his band who played an Explorer. And I had never seen an Explorer before. And I thought, wow, that is a really cool looking guitar. And I thought, well, what if I took that shape, put a curly maple top on it, and built a guitar that looked like that, sunburst finish, binding like a Les Paul. Make an Explorer look like a Les Paul.
So there were some of us who were interested in these old guitars, and Jim was one of the first guys to try to make one, and he made a few, and we bought some raw guitars. When I say guitars, I mean completed guitars with frets in them and everything, but they weren't painted.
And we added a maple top and put some binding on it and gave it a sunburst finish. Actually, one of those wound up with Rick Nielsen in the early Cheap Trick days, and that was the guitar that he became associated with.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, look, doesn't that look like an Explorer?
It does.
They were called Hamer Standards. But it's got like a Les Paul curly maple top. PAF, and these knobs are straight down as opposed to going at the angle. And the truss rod cover, or the toggle switch, is screwed into the top because there's no routing on the back for it. And all the wiring and everything, unlike the Gibson Explorer, is underneath the curly maple top put on it.
When he picked up that guitar and put it on his body, it was him. It just fit him perfectly. And so he said, I'll take one. I want a natural one. And I said, oh, natural. Okay, I'll try to do that. But it just took forever. And in the meantime, he said, hey, Paul, would you lend me your guitar? And I said, oh, yeah, I can lend you the guitar. And then
is this like the Cherry Burst one that's on the fold out on Budokan?
Yeah. And so it just...
He's wearing it with like a Strat, and he's wearing like three guitars.
Yeah. And that's the one. And he ended up buying that from me, too, because the natural one took so long.
Paul's guitar would years later be stamped and numbered 0000, beginning what is now referred to as the 4-digit Hamers. This guitar was just meant to be Paul's personal guitar to use in the shop. However, on the night of December 7th, 1974, with this guitar having been finished earlier that day, Paul Hamer and Jol Dantzig would bring it, along with various vintage guitars, backstage to a Wishbone Ash concert. This would prove to be a pivotal moment for Paul Hamer and Jol Dantzig.
I finished my first guitar December 7th, 1974, and I made my first sale December 7th, 1974, too. Yeah, it's a little bit of a coincidence.
I took it to show to Andy Powell because he played Flying V's. I thought, wow, he might be interested in this. So, and I have a picture of him playing it backstage at a Wishbone Ash concert. He wasn't really interested. He liked it, but he wasn't interested in it. He's more into the Flying V's. But the bass player, Martin Turner, looked at it and said, "Can you make a bass like this?" I was with, Paul Hamer, and he kind of looked at me, and I just turned to Martin and said, "Sure, of course we can." And he said, "Okay, but I want it like this. Can you make it black, but with a little bit of metal flake in it, like a starry sky?" "Oh, yeah, sure." And, we could put the Thunderbird pickups on it and a Thunderbird, it'll play just like your Thunderbird, but it'll look really cool. "Okay, great. If you make it, I'll buy it." And we got outside, and Paul goes, "Why the hell did you tell him that? We don't know how to make a bass."
By the summer of 1975, and armed with 10 custom guitar orders, Paul Hamer, Jol Dantzig, along with John Montgomery and Jim Walker, formed Hamer Guitars.
John and another partner, Jim, they were in the basement making the guitars on a daily basis while we would go out and try to drum up the business and get the sales going.
Jim Walker, the fourth original partner of Hamer Guitars, was a college student at the University of Chicago during that summer of 1975, whom Monty recruited to help out with the repairs initially, but would later get involved in those early custom-built guitars.
Right. And at that point, we decided, okay, well, maybe we should really get serious about this and, give it a name and everything. I remember calling a little meeting. I had a Volkswagen bus, and I think this is going to go. We should make a guitar company and try to make a go of it. Got these big names playing it. I don't see any reason why we couldn't make a few of these things every month. And, it's an income stream. We could do some cool stuff, and it makes our shop more important to the touring musicians. And, it's all word of mouth.
We picked the name Hamer, I think, because it just sounded good to me. I thought it was a great idea. It had that kind of guitar ring, Fender or Hamer, Gibson. It just had that, besides, I thought I was going to go on and become a rock star.
Now, I had managed to get some real patent applied fors from Gibson. They were in the reject bin, or, people would send their guitars in to have them updated or cleaned up, and they had scratched chrome, so they'd take the pickups out. "Oh, I want those new pickups, redo everything." And they'd just take the old pickups out and throw them in a box, and they would have a big box full of discarded pickups. And some of them worked and some of them didn't. And we just took the whole box. So in the beginning, we had a bunch of patent applied for humbuckers to put in our guitars.
After those were gone, they tried using the current, at the time, Gibson T-top humbuckers, but they were soon dissatisfied with the results. So they turned to a young pickup builder from New York named Larry DiMarzio.
When Larry was winding pickups himself in a little shop on 48th Street doing repair, and we would send him bobbins, we'd send him pickups. Those were some of the first pickups that we used in the Hamers. We would take Gibson pickups, which people didn't like the way they sounded in the 70s. So we'd send them the pickups, and they'd take all the wire off and start over, because nobody had their own bobbins. Nobody had, this aftermarket was just getting started. So Larry would rewind these pickups for us. And
they ultimately decided on a custom version of his PAF. And the one that they decided on had a slightly hotter bridge pickup and a slightly rolled back bass neck pickup. All of them in stock condition are a double cream and a zebra. They always did it that way. You'll see exceptions on very early ones, but for the most part, that's what they went with. Ironically, they apparently used up all the prototypes that were sent because of money constraints.
The Standard would be the first model officially introduced by the newly formed Hamer Guitars.
But we started selling the guitars. We started running an ad in Guitar Player magazine, like a little black and white ad, and continued to go to the shows. And we sold one to Martin Barr of Jethro Tull. We sold one to Mick Ralphs of Bad Company. We made a bass for Boz Burrell, who was the bass player for Bad Company. Rick Derringer. A lot of people that we dealt with were these, touring acts. And once we started showing them guitars, we started getting orders for them.
And so at the very beginning, the instrument was being played on stage in front of a lot of people every night, and it was so unusual looking. Everybody had never seen it before, so it got some name recognition very early on.
While early models of the Standard would vary somewhat in regards to features, they would all be based around the design of that first model.
And it's sort of a hybrid Explorer Les Paul SG in that it's a Honduras mahogany body, one piece, mahogany neck, rosewood fingerboard. The two-piece top is actually veneer. It's not a solid top. They just wanted it to look classy. Two humbuckers, a control setup not unlike the original Explorer, where you have a volume, and a master tone control pickup selector switch.
It was born out of necessity, really. We thought that the vintage trade was, the guitars are getting more expensive. We didn't think that people would continue to pay that kind of money for it.
We were at the forefront of the vintage guitar, at least in electric instruments. We were at the forefront of that and selling vintage instruments to musicians, and seeing the growth of that, the early growth of the vintage market. And because we came out of that was our aesthetic. That's what we were shooting for.
I'm in the middle. The taller guy is Paul Hamer, and the other guy is Jol Dantzig. And this is Northern Prairie, 1974. I had to learn a lot from, Paul, Joel, and a couple of the guys who worked in the making the early custom instruments, or what people refer to now as the 4-digit serial number standards and things. And all, if we would make something for, back in the day, whoever it was, that those were worked on pretty much by John Montgomery or John McHugh. I was hired back then, Hamer, as a guitar player, because they wanted somebody who could set the guitars up to play perfectly, knew how to do that. And there's a lot of little nuance to that, setting up a guitar. When you put the strings on it from them to when it's finished. And the idea was that when we finished with the guitar in my area, in the setup area, you could take that guitar anywhere on stage right then, plug in and go. You don't need to worry about it.
Wow.
It's going to be perfectly in tune. It's going to sound, and that, I pride myself on that because I had many compliments over the year. We did that all the time. We would take a guitar to someone and they would just put it on and start playing at the show. And they would come up later and just say, it was incredible. There's nothing they had to do with it. Usually, guitars have to go, or even at a music store, have to go through all this secondary setup because they weren't right. And, the strings are out of tune. It's not intonated. The nut isn't cut right. But we even when we send things to stores, they didn't have to do anything. And they would, right out of the case, right out of the box, they were amazed.
But a lot of guys who were playing brand new Gibsons or brand new Fenders, they would plug in the guitars that we brought, just like the vintage guitars when we were hawking those backstage. We would bring them a Hamer guitar, and they'd plug it in, and they'd just go, holy shit, that's how we started.
The idea of selling direct to the customer was also paired with print advertising that was simple and effective.
In a fit of Herculean modesty, their very first ads referred to them as the ultimate guitar, new or old. That's pretty brave. You gotta love this arrogance. It's so American.
Compared to the advertising used by Fender and Gibson from this time period, Hamer heavily utilized stark photography combined with their iconic Bookman bold italic font to make some unforgettable imagery. Ad copy, when used, is direct, bold, and makes a statement. This is the ultimate guitar. Old or new, the Hamer Standard, even printed in black and white, was an undeniable guitar. The term "the ultimate" originally came from Rick Nielsen as a term he would use jokingly with Paul.
One time, Rick would call me And he would always start this conversation the same. He'd go, "All right, Paul, the Ultimate." And I go, "Hey, Rick, the Ultimate." And so we adopted the Ultimate as our slogan, and then BMW had the same slogan later on. So
BMW, the ultimate driving machine.
He gave me the idea for that slogan, and that's what I said on our T-shirts. Said the Ultimate on the front and Hamer Guitars on the back. So we started giving these T-shirts out to all the musicians that we would meet, and then they'd get their pictures taken in Circus Magazine.
Our concept was, this is a vintage style guitar that can stand with a vintage guitar, sounds as good, plays as good, and has a certain, vibe to it that would appeal to a guy who played vintage guitars or was interested in a vintage guitar. But it was priced reasonably compared to a vintage guitar. Now, that price was more than a brand new guitar, but we were not interested in going into stores and dealing with, distributors and that whole thing.
They did a very limited production between 1975 and 78. They made maybe 50 by their estimate, and 76 to 79, when Gibson did their first Explorer reissue, they shipped around 3,300. So you see the juxtaposition in the production abilities.
It's a big step going from, doing something part-time you just do it in your house, so you have no overhead, and suddenly you have a storefront, you have to pay insurance, you have to get an alarm, you have to, then you start getting employees, it starts growing, and then now you have to sell guitars every day, and it was a big challenge for us, but it was exciting at the same time.
The courage of taking on a project like this. In 1975, the guitar cost essentially $800, which was more expensive than a Les Paul Custom at the time. And within 2 years or so, they were about $1,200, which was a lot of money back then.
It turned out we sold the guitars way too cheaply. I just had no idea of how manufacturers price stuff, and I was a manufacturer.
Our attitude in the very beginning was, we're just going to sell to pros, because the guy on the street, we'd show him a guitar for $1,200 and they'd go, "That's nuts. I can go get a brand new Gibson for half of that." And the truth of the matter was that we were selling to rock stars who were paying twice that for a vintage guitar.
Hamer Guitars would also lose two of its founding partners in late 1975, with John Montgomery wanting to start a mandolin company and Jim Walker returning to school in order to finish his master's degree.
And as the orders came in, it became clear that we were starting to get behind. We couldn't actually make the guitars fast enough because we weren't really set up like a factory or anything like that. And because I had a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of understanding of things mechanical, it kind of fell into my lap to design the systems and the factory, so to speak, the workshop to build them in. So we decided to get into a bigger shop. And that's when we closed down Northern Prairie Music and actually moved it into a proper shop facility, which was in Palatine, Illinois. It was about 1,500 square feet. It wasn't very big, but we built everything by hand with a bunch of friends, a spray booth and workbenches, and that was our first proper workshop.
There, they would move Hamer Guitars to its new home at 544 Wood Street. Despite their reluctance early on, Hamer Guitars had started selling to dealers.
Some of the bigger stores like Pastore in New Jersey and Parker Music down in Houston, they had their finger on the pulse of what was going on. And these guys were also, if you're a touring musician, you're going to these big stores because you're stopping at the big venues. You got the afternoon off before sound check. You go to the music store. They'd ask about it. They'd say, "Hey, have you heard of this?" Or they might even say, "I bought this when I was in Chicago. Check it out." A couple of the bigger dealers wanted in. That's how it started. And we had to learn the whole thing about how the discount structure for dealers worked and the markup and everything. We learned it pretty. We knew some of it because we were in the business. We were buying stuff and selling it. But suddenly we had to apply it to what we were already doing. It was another tier.
And it would be these early dealers that would influence the next guitar from Hamer.
And then after too long, they come back and they go, well, these are really great, and, we've got a market for it, but, we could sell a lot more if you could come out with a guitar that's a little more mainstream and it's cheaper. I took a 59 double cutaway Les Paul Jr., plopped it down on a piece of paper, traced the outside of the body, and said, what if we put humbuckers on this bitch? Well, how about if it's strung through the back like a Telecaster? We can get those Telecaster bridges, because you couldn't buy too many aftermarket parts at the time. It wasn't like you could get on the computer and go to Stu Mac or whatever. And so we made a little cut down guitar in a brilliant marketing move. We called it the Sunburst.
The Sunburst would feature a double cutaway Les Paul Jr. style one-piece mahogany body paired with a one-piece maple veneer top and binding, including the same wiring and pickups as the standard. The Sunburst, originally available in, you guessed it, Cherry Sunburst, was Hamer's way of speeding up production and offering up a starting price tag of $699 when it debuted at the June 1977 NAMM show. While the new location in Palatine was bigger, they still didn't have the space to do the initial wood cutting and lumber storage. While John Montgomery stayed on with the company to continue building, his overall output was slowing down, which meant Hamer needed to find another source for guitar bodies and necks for this new Sunburst model. Through George Gruhn, a friend of Paul Hamer's and widely considered to have opened one of the first vintage guitar stores, they learned about a builder out of Nashville, Tom Holmes. Tom had previously worked for Gruhn doing repairs, but had recently leased a small factory in order to start building his own guitars. THC, or Tom Holmes Company, would later go on to build guitars for Bo Diddley, Albert King, Billy Gibbons. Gruhn recommended THC to Paul and Joel, and soon a deal was struck for Tom Holmes Company to create the bodies and necks for this new Sunburst model. John Montgomery would continue to produce the bodies and necks for the standard and other custom orders.
When we were looking to expand beyond our little basement wood shop, workshop thing, and we hooked up with Tom Holmes down in Nashville, and Tom was making the THC guitars. A master craftsman and really, really great guy, and went down there to take a look at his operation and see if he could provide us with the parts that we needed.
By the middle of 1978, it is estimated that Hamer had completed over 300 Sunburst models, thanks to the increased production coming from Tom Holmes. However, problems with warping necks, a structural flaw causing one side of the neck to be lower or even twisted, started becoming an issue with the Sunburst models coming from the THC factory. Holmes would argue the warping was caused by the pre-fretted fingerboards they sourced from Gibson at the time. A solution would be found by replacing the one-piece mahogany neck with what would be termed a stress neck. This would require 3 pieces of mahogany glued together to create greater stability, albeit at a higher cost and increased production time.
The idea when I started out with Cheap Trick, I wanted to get a really huge bass sound. So I had the idea that I would get a 12-string electric guitar. I had a Fender 12, solid body, and I thought I'm going to buy an octave box and have an octave lower, so it'll be like a 12-string guitar playing along with the bass. Well, that never worked. It never followed, and it was terrible. So I thought, if they just made a bass that had guitar strings and, kind of like an 8-string, but more strings, like a 12-string guitar playing along with a 4-string. So in the early 70s, some friends of ours had a vintage guitar shop in Chicago, Paul Hamer and Jol Dantzig, and they were going to start a guitar company, which they ended up doing, Hamer Guitars. And I told them the idea, and they thought, it sounds kind of goofy. Well, we'll do it. By 1977, we were on a tour with Kiss, and they showed up at one of the shows with the first bass, and I just started using it, and I've been using it really live with Cheap Trick ever since.
So the thing was, it was going to be a quad bass too, which means every string set of 3 strings, a root and 2 octaves, had a separate control: volume, tone, treble, but so you could control the thing any way you wanted for any type of sounds.
An interesting instrument, and it certainly has its place in the bassist vocabulary today. When you say 12-string bass, most bass players go, "Oh yeah, I know what that is." But back then, it was a totally different kind of concept.
An E, A, D, and G, the four.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so like the E has the root note, which would be like normal bass, and then 2 octaves.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Like a 12-string, but yeah.
2 octaves, same thing.
Wow.
So like the G strings, the octaves are plain steel strings. They're not wound. So we went to pick it up from the custom little shop in Wilmette where they were doing the work on that. Joel picks me up, and it's the middle of winter.
Yeah.
And there's snow all over. It's like a blizzard. So, and we have to drive from Wilmette to Palatine. So we're driving along, and
it's about 20 miles.
And of course, wasn't wearing a seatbelt. When all of a sudden we're going along, and we see a car swerve from the other side of the road that's coming in the opposite direction, and it's coming right at us. And we look out, and all of a sudden we're crashed into. And we spun around, which is probably the only thing that saved us, is because the road was full of snow and ice, and it was slippery, so you kind of bounced off of something. But I hit the windshield, and kind of like my arm went numb, and I couldn't talk for like 30 seconds, like I was stunned. And then came back, and Joel, he had crashed into the steering wheel, and he was bleeding. And so when we regained our senses, oh my God, we're in this accident. What are we doing? And then we're going to get out and realize, oh, the 12-string bass is in the back seat. We had just picked it up.
Without a case.
Without a case. So we look at that, and then here comes the ambulance, and we had to go. We took the bass on the ambulance. Off we went to the hospital to get checked out.
The 12-string bass got its own gurney. George Martin produced All Shook Up for Cheap Trick.
This is a good one.
Paul got a letter from George Martin. This is when All You Need Is Ears just came out, his first book.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul got a letter from George Martin praising the 12-string bass and what a unique instrument it was and blah, blah, blah. But he had a question. How do you get bass out of it?
And about this time, we also, a friend of Paul's was Frank Untermyer. They had gone to school together, and Frank was a business major, and he was keen to use some of his skill and wanted to come on board. And guitars and music and rock and roll seemed like a pretty exciting thing, I think, to him. I'll let him explain what his motivations were.
In college, my first year, going over to Germany to do a historical project on violins, actually. And went over there, and I found a violin making school in Mittenwald. And so I applied to go to school there. And they only would accept one American a year. and there was already an American there, and so I ended up doing wood carving instead. So I went over to Germany, studied wood carving, and I had a buddy from high school named Paul Hamer, who was getting involved with some other people, Jol Dantzig and a couple of other guys in retail. And I came back to the States, and I decided to write my master's thesis on what they were doing internationally, because that was my focus, was all international work. So rather than just writing a master's thesis, I went to the company. I took a semester off of school. I was up in Wisconsin at the time, and I started their export business. And one thing led to the next, and I just stayed on at Hamer Guitars. And I became an owner of the company, and we built it up, and that's how I got involved.
But because of his background, his business background, Paul thought that he would be a good addition. We should bring him on board, and eventually he bought into the company and became a partner.
And he was really critical in getting Germans on board, and Germany was a big European market.
He really ran the front end. He ran the business, did the purchasing, did all the books, and ran the day-to-day in the company. He was really he was the guy who ran the office.
That was about we were about 5 years into the program when he came on board, and it's a good choice. Hard-working guy and a brilliant person. Really amazing individual. I've learned a real lot from him.
They may be crazy, but they certainly aren't lazy, because Cheap Trick are one of the hardest working bands on the rock circuit today, and they've built up a huge following in Japan, Europe and the US of A. With 5 albums released, each one doubling the sales of the preceding one, these 4 talented rockers seem to be set for superstardom in the 1980s.
Cheap Trick got huge, and they were the biggest band in the land, by the late 70s. By then, everything that they did eclipsed anything that we had ever done for them. They sold so many of our guitars, and we have Rick to thank for that, and I'll always be grateful.
We've done a lot of wacky things as a result of Rick Nielsen, some of which, were pretty far out there. I think more importantly was he opened doors for so many other bands to play Hamers, because that band today is still on the road 300 days a year. I mean, they're constantly touring after 35 or 40 years. There's a lot of people who have a lot of respect for them. I think of bands like Pearl Jam or King's X that were directly impacted by Cheap Trick and started playing our guitars as well. So that, I think, would be incomplete if we didn't say, call out what Rick and Robin and Tom have done for us as well.
They're the same way today, 40, 50 years on. They're the same guys, the same wonderful personalities. They're really nice people. They're grounded, because they've had to fight for it all the time.
Paul Hamer knew that I collected guitars. He came to Philadelphia when I was living there in 1972, I think it was, and bought one of my Les Paul standards for $2,500. Wow. And my wife was pregnant. We didn't have any money. We had no insurance.
So I flew to Philadelphia. I bought the guitar, came back home. I sold it. It was the money that helped me start the guitar company. It gave me a little savings in the bank. And it allowed Rick to move back to Rockford with his wife, and they had their first son born in Rockford, and they've never left.
Well, if you think, the first album, we were all 4 on the cover.
Right.
But and that record was side 1 and side A. There was no side B or side 2. That's that little dopey stuff that I think makes a big difference. That's like me on Heaven Tonight having a checkerboard toothbrush. What? It's like
details. It's in the details.
And I have an in-color postcard in my back pocket. It's like, why'd you do that? I don't know why I do stuff. Yeah, I've never sold one pick ever, and.
But you throw them away. How many a year at this point?
Well, I buy them, order 60,000 at a time.
Wow.
And I order at least a couple times a year.
You keep them in the bedroom or the bathroom?
None of your business.
Okay.
That's where I got part of the idea for the multi-neck guitars. I'd stack them on top of each other. If you see me, I think it was 79.
Yeah.
On Guitar Player, I've got three or four
guitars on.
So I used to go, and take it, throw it. I couldn't rely on my technique.
Well, I've had trouble when I was in school. I'm still having trouble learning how to play guitar. So one of the things I do is I just play lots of guitars, and that way I don't seem to have much trouble anymore.
Fred Nugent will ever be.
Into our Arlington Heights facility. I thought that was very important. We changed a lot of the things that we did. We improved the process. We improved the product itself.
Oh, we'd love to make more guitars, but I think the number one thing is if the quality isn't there, the name won't mean anything.
A lot of tough competition, and I wasn't getting along with some others in the company.
So it came, to a parting of the ways with one of the founding members, with Paul Hamer. We needed to find another way to sell our guitars.
Charlie Kaman epitomizes the Connecticut inventor.
Kaman Corporation started in 1945 with $2,000. And that's the great American story.
Then they brought in the import line.
I left Hamer because it became a big drag. I'd done it for 5 years the corporate way, and it was like, okay, I want to do something else, so I split.
And there's a 5-neck back there. It's the only one in the world because I'm the only one dumb enough to want one like that.